And so when we think about all these things that have happened historically for black women, we think about how this strong black woman schema has come about. Again, this is a schema that combines racial and gender experiences that black women have had based on not only just their race, but also their sex and their gender. Now we can go on to the next slide. All right, so what is the strong black woman schema? And so research has identified the strong black woman schema in different ways, but I've highlighted a few things here on the slide. So it's a perception that black women are naturally strong, resilient, self-contained, and self-sacrificing. Also, a set of expectations for African American women, notably standing up for oneself and exhibiting self-reliance and taking care of others, sometimes and a lot of times at the expense of themselves. And then also, it developed partially as a result of efforts to counteract negative societal characterizations. And so there has been a lot of dehumanization, trying to say that word, that has happened throughout different medical settings, throughout history, so on and so forth, that has impacted the black women and the development of the strong black woman schema. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And so there was a study done that looked at a lot of things with black women, and specifically it asked black women, what does the strong black woman schema encompass? And so black women in this study specifically identified that the strong black woman schema is an obligation to manifest strength. It's also an obligation to suppress emotions. It means that black women cannot be vulnerable, or they can't show their emotions, or they don't have the space to do that. It also means that there's this idea that black women must succeed. There's no other option outside of that, and sometimes that's why black women rely on that strength to make it through certain circumstances. And then it's also an obligation to help others. Again, I mentioned earlier that sometimes this obligation to help others bleeds over into the fact that black women are not taking care of themselves because they have to take care of everyone else around them. And then participants in this study that were black women also talked about the contextual factors that contributed to the embodiment of this stigma or this schema. And so the historical legacy of racial or gender stereotyping, oppression, lessons from their foremothers. And so sometimes the strong black woman schema is something that's passed down through generations. And so the things that we learn about exuding strength sometimes come from our mothers, our grandmothers, our aunties, so on and so forth. So it's passed down throughout the family cycle. And then when we think about what are some perceived benefits that might be associated with the strong black woman schema, why is this something that black women are still kind of internalizing and using as a cultural tool sometimes to ward off things like oppression or racism or sexism even for that matter? And so some black women identified that this is a way for them to survive. If they don't adopt it, then they can't survive in this society. Some other black women noted that it's a way that they can preserve the family. It gives them a sense of being a part of the African American community. And then some other black women noted that it is a key part of making sure that the family stays together. And so black women place that role on their shoulders. It's something that they deem as their responsibility specifically. All right, and then when we think about some liabilities, and so getting into some of the concerns that might come up with adopting the strong black woman schema and what that means for mental health for black women. So it's a strain on their interpersonal relationships. If you're always having to show up for others, sometimes you don't have the means to take care of yourself, and then by the time you're done taking care of everyone else, you don't want to do anything anymore. You don't have any more energy, so on and so forth. Then we think about stress-related behaviors, and so this can be postponement of self-care, so you're not doing anything to take care of yourself, emotionally eating sometimes. This can also mean poor sleep habits, so on and so forth. And then stress, anxiety, depression, a lot of those things that Courtney talked about earlier when she went over or gave us some statistics about different maternal mental health concerns that might arise. We can go on to the next slide. All right, so the role of the strong black woman schema and maternal mental health specifically, we can move forward. And so although the strong black woman schema has also had some negative aspects, black women have also identified that, of course, it has some protective components to it as well. And so some of those protective components have been identified as daily functioning in the context of motherhood. So it gives black women strength to operate in the ways that they need to in settings where they are showcasing or being a mother figure. Some black women have identified feeling empowered or a sense of resiliency from adopting this schema. Again, family preservation, and then it's also critical for their survival in a context or in a society where racism and sexism is something that's still very prevalent. All right, we can move forward. And so then when we think about the risk factors that might be associated with the strong Black woman schema, so there's an intersection of motherhood, that is, you have to be the super strong Black mother. And so you can't just be a mother, you have to be super strong as a mother. And then also, this is an emotionally taxing experience. Again, not being able to just be, but you have to be and be strong while doing it. And then the strong Black woman role may hinder Black women from seeking help for perinatal anxiety and depression. There is one study where Black women was asked about their experiences of seeking help, and one thing that stood out in that study is that Black women identified other folks can seek help, but they can't. And then, of course, the strong Black woman schema has a risk factor of a lack of emotionality, so I don't have time to express my emotions, because if I express my emotions, then that makes me look like I am weak or I am too vulnerable, and people will take advantage of that. All right, we can move on to the next slide. And so some more risk factors as it relates to the strong Black woman and maternal mental health specifically. And so there are some highlighted risk and protective factors that may intensify with pregnancy and maternal care. And so think about the fact that Black women are already expected to be strong, but then think about how strong you have to be when you're also pregnant at the same time. Then the strong Black woman stereotype might impact the level or quality of care that Black women receive in medical settings. And so again, if you are with a medical doctor who doesn't know much about the strong Black woman schema, you might tell them you're in pain, they might not believe you, for example. And then it also leads to the false perceptions about Black women and how they may or may not, or the care they may or may not need after, during, and before pregnancy. All right, we can go on to the next slide. And so with all of that I've kind of gone over, I've talked about some risk factors, I've talked about some protective factors. One thing that's coming up in the research a lot is that this is still something that Black women deem as key to Black womanhood. And so although there are some negative things that coincide with the strong Black woman schema, it's something that Black women, young, old, throughout the whole age range, it's still something that's being adopted and relied on pretty heavily. Again, it's something that's passed down through those messages that we receive from foremothers within our families. And so scholars are saying that is the strong Black woman schema a negative thing or is it a bad thing? It's more so it's a both and thing. And so what scholars are identifying now is that Black women need to look at the strong Black woman schema for both its usefulness and then also its risk factors, or its ability to help Black women, and then it's also its ability to be detrimental to Black women's care and well-being. All right, so moving into some treatment specific to Black women and maternal mental health, we can go on to the next slide. So, is this me, Courtney? Is this me? Okay, so treatment is important. And so 75% of women with maternal mental health symptoms go undertreated or untreated. That's something to think about as we talk about some of the things that Courtney shared, but then also as we think about the strong Black woman schema and how Black women are showing up to maybe some of these doctor's appointments that they're having while they're pregnant. And then when we think about the medical mistrust and the perceptions that medical doctors might have, how does the strong Black woman schema interfere with how Black women report pain? And so something that Courtney mentioned earlier is that sometimes Black women report their pain as more physical as opposed to emotional or psychological. And so that's something to think about, because even with all of that, again, the strong Black woman schema is this schema that's telling Black women, okay, I can't do this. I can't say I'm in pain because they're not going to believe me. I can't say I'm in pain because then I'm not strong, for example. All right, we can move forward. So coping, I'm going to talk about self-compassion and then also self-care. The definitions are here, but they're also on the next slide. So we can move forward to the next slide. All right, so when we think about self-care, I think you can click one more time, some pictures will come up. And then once more. Thank you. Back one slide. Yes, thank you. So we can think about self-care. So I think self-care is something that's often thrown out there, or individuals are told, you need to engage in self-care, you need to engage in self-care. But many of us actually don't know what self-care means exactly. And sometimes we get self-care confused with this idea of self-soothing. And so what self-soothing is activities that provide you comfort or distraction in difficult times. And so this might mean instead of doing something that you're supposed to do, you decide to just watch a TV series and you just sit in bed all day and you watch whatever your favorite series is, and that's okay. I think when we think about things like the Strong Black Woman Schema, we don't always think that we have the space to just rest and be and do or engage in activities that allow us to be self-soothing. But that's something that we can think about there. Then when we also think about self-care, these are activities that help you find meaning and they support your growth. And then I also added some information here because there was a study that asked Black women what they think self-care looks like for them. And there were 4 things that they identified. The first being deep work. And so what that means is getting to the root of the issue. And so what is causing you pain? What is causing you mental health concerns, for example? And then they talked about authority, and so taking action and making sure that you are setting boundaries. And so what that might look like is someone asks you to do something, instead of saying yes, you might say no. It's as simple as that. And then reconnection, so getting back in tune with your mind, body, and spirit. And so sometimes when things happen in our life, when we might have some maternal mental health conditions, for example, we kind of get thrown off of our equilibrium. And so Black women in this study identified that it's important for them to get back in tune with their mind, body, and spirit as they think about how they can take care of themselves. And then exploration, and so identifying what's important for you. Self-care looks different for everyone, and that's okay. And then accountability, and so Black women identified having support systems, and then also within those support systems, having someone that will hold them accountable and be disciplined as they navigate challenges is something that they deemed as helpful and helps them identify what self-care looks like for them specifically.
Before we move forward, I just wanted to add one more thing. Could you go back one slide? So just to make sure that we're kind of aware on the distinction between self-care and self-soothing, a quote that I think is a really good quote to understand it is, self-soothing is easy, self-care is hard. So if you notice that you're doing some of these things that LaKaylin listed related to like deep work or accountability, exploration, you notice these things take intentional energy, right? Intentional time to put towards. And so we have to make sure that we are being very present and intentional about engaging in self-care as not something that, okay, I'll do this on Saturday and Sunday, right? This is something I'll do when I'm not at work, right? Self-care should be something that is kind of intentional and done throughout your entire week, right?
I just want to follow up on 2 things you had up there, the boundaries. So setting those boundaries, authority, taking action to create those boundaries. I know y'all love that area, but it really helps y'all. So, a lot of times you have to set boundaries even with your own family members. Even though our family members are our support persons, you do have to have boundaries because you do have family members sometimes that kind of contribute to our mental health conditions that we experience. And there was one more up here I was looking at, accountability. So I like to have accountability partners, especially when if I'm trying to lose weight or something, I just set a goal for whatever you're doing. You know how you have that person that's gonna hold you accountable. So like, I'll tell you a way I do it at work, and everybody knows when I hadn't done something I set a goal for at work. If I didn't write that article or write that paragraph of what I said I was gonna do, if you see me taking the stairs, because I hate the stairs, Dr. Thomas knows that, I hate the stairs. If I take the stairs, that's because I know my accountability partner is somewhere waiting to see if I took those stairs because they knew I didn't meet my goals. So it's really important to have that as well as far as your self-care because you do need help with that.
All right, we can go on to the next slide. All right, and then thinking about self-care and then moving into self-compassion. And so sometimes we don't feel like figuring out what is the thing that I can do to self-soothe or what is the thing that I can do to take care of myself. Sometimes we just need to give ourselves a little bit of grace and space to just be. And so some things I have here as it relates to this slide on self-compassion. And so self-compassion is how we relate to ourselves in instances of perceived failure or inadequacy, and then also personal suffering. And then sometimes it's not about what we do, as in the case of self-soothing or self-care for ourselves, but how we decide to be towards ourselves. And so how do we treat ourselves? And then at times, self-care may also feel like another task that we must check off of our to-do list. Again, we don't always feel like identifying what's something that I can do right now to make myself feel better. And then also it's centered on the idea of giving yourself grace in whatever capacity best fits your needs personally. And so that's something to think about, maybe in those moments where you don't feel like engaging in self-care, just to remember to give yourself some compassion. And then as we think about social support, especially as we come off of talking about the Strong Black Woman Schema and then maternal mental health and things like that, sometimes I know as therapists, Courtney and I are always talking about therapy and the benefits of therapy, but then also we have to think about that social support looks like many different things. And so a multidisciplinary approach is sometimes best for folks. And so that might be psychologists, counselors, social workers, that can be physical or occupational therapists, that can be general practitioners, that might be doulas or midwives for individuals who are pregnant or Black women who are pregnant. That might be friends, it might be family, might not be. And then also holistic healers and teachers, physicians, so on and so forth. And so again, sometimes not having just one system of support, but having several is something that's very beneficial, especially for Black women who might be experiencing maternal mental health conditions. All right, we can move forward.
So after we've kind of gone through all of this information, we always think it's important to give you some actionable things to do. Like, what could you leave here today and do to improve treatment access for Black women, to go forward with this information? And the first is just know. So you're doing that by coming today, educating yourselves on maternal mental health, knowing what maternal mental health services are available. So we're going to give you some resources related to maternal mental health that are local and at the national level once we finish. But just making sure that you're aware of how does someone get access. Discussing, again, you're doing the step today as well. So making sure that you have, like Dr. Ware said at the beginning, non-judgmental conversations about mental health with your loved ones, right? The way that we destigmatize is to have the conversations with folks like it's normal, right? And so making sure that you continue to talk to someone else. I'm going to challenge you. When you leave here, share one fact with somebody you haven't talked to about mental health yet that you learned today. And kind of make it more normal and accepted for folks to have the conversation with you. That's kind of how we spread and destigmatize. And then lastly, advocating when it comes to maternal mental health. So like we said, Black women are kind of being heavily undertreated for mental health services. And so it's important that we advocate for Black women, advocate for ourselves, and kind of increase actions related to Black women's voices being heard when they say, hey, I'm not feeling too high, I need mental health services, right? And so making sure that we're listening to mothers, or that we are being heard in certain spaces, and speaking up when we have other people in our lives who are experiencing these same difficulties. We can move forward. Okay, so now we'll have a Q&A. If you all have any questions, feel free to let them fly, and LaKaylin and I will answer them for you. Any questions, any thoughts?
Yes, I have a question.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, and not just in our community, but, we suffer from traumas, childhood traumas or whatever.
Yeah.
So are those traumas, are these conditions separate from, or are they compound, or are they a mixture, or do they contribute, or all of the above?
Absolutely. So that's a really good question. Trauma is absolutely in the research shown to be related to higher risk of maternal mental health conditions. As LaKaylin mentioned, there is a history in this country of things that bring Black individuals generally trauma over generations, right? And so we all experience trauma, which makes our risk higher for mental health conditions. So it's important that when we are treating folks for mental health concerns, we as counselors are supposed to take a trauma-informed approach, right? And so addressing your trauma is a necessary part of adequately treating mental health concerns for Black people and for Black women during the maternal health process. Does that answer your question? Oh, you got it.
The trauma
take it? You want me to? Okay. So when we think about trauma-informed care, first of all, it depends on the type of trauma, right? And so, and so if we're thinking about like birth trauma, so say she gave birth, it was a very traumatic experience for her, okay? So what she might do is she might go into therapy. They might teach her some specific stress relief skills, right? Okay, see, yes. Yeah, there's a lot of trauma after the first baby. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to, it's important for us in our own communities to meet each other where we are, right? And so a lot of times when we think about trauma as mental health professionals, we might be able to say, oh yeah, that's trauma, right? But the person that is on the other side of us may not be there yet, right? And so we want to also make sure that we're meeting folks where we are, and maybe just getting them in the door is enough to say, hey, well, maybe I know this has been a difficult time, and you might need a little more support. I learned that, you could get support from this place. You could just go talk to someone. Maybe you go and have a consultation, right? And so just getting someone in the door can be good enough. Because a lot of times our trauma is deeply embedded, and it takes time for us to peel those layers back in a safe way. And so making sure that we kind of meet our family members where they are with that.
I was going to add something to that. One thing that it made me think about, especially Courtney, as you were saying, that sometimes our trauma is very deep rooted. Sometimes we can think about trauma as being intergenerational. And so there's this idea of intergenerational trauma, meaning that certain trauma that someone might have experienced is passed down through generations, sometimes in their attitudes and their behaviors, and that might be something that impacts other family members, for example. Even with something like the Strong Black Woman Schema, some Black women categorize that as being a part of intergenerational trauma, especially when some of those very negative messages have been passed down throughout their generations, or they don't know how to be vulnerable. Because one thing that happens specifically with Black women as it relates to mental health, and maybe the adoption of the Strong Black Woman Schema, is that something that comes up is that Black women seek help, but when they seek help, they're almost at the point of no return. And so that's something to consider, especially as it relates to the Strong Black Woman Schema, Black women in general, Black folks in general.
Yeah.
At what point do we go and seek help? Is it when it's almost too late? And so that's something to think about as well.
Thank you.
I have one more question. I say one more, but I did receive a question for us to define the term schema.
Yes. And so for me, when I think about the Strong Black Woman Schema, or when I think about a schema specifically, it's like a headspace or a thought that you have that's internalized. And so there might be things that might have happened in the external environment, or so in society, for example, for Black women, those messages they have internalized, and now that's become a common appearance in their thought processes and how they operate. Does that make sense? Yes.
Good question. So it depends on the insurance. This is why it's important. That's why I put no on that other slide. But if you call your insurance, they will be able to tell you whether or not services are covered, who might be a provider that you could go to, and how many sessions. So some insurances will say, well, yes, we'll cover mental health, but only for 10 sessions. So it'll be important to know. Some insurance companies will say, we'll cover unlimited sessions. So this is why it's important. They're not going to put it on your card. It's not going to be something they advertise, but to call your insurance and say, hey, I'm looking for a mental health provider. I need you to connect me with one that's in network.
So, I'm sorry.
Absolutely. That's amazing. Yeah, so I think you bring up a good point. It's also important. It never hurts to ask, right? And so if you are employed, ask your employers if they have coverage. Another thing that's really important related to mental health services is some people operate on a sliding scale. And so that is to say that you come in and you say, this is what I got. This is what I can afford, right? And the provider will work with you to make sure that you can still get services at a price that works for you. So making sure that you don't kind of let it deter you from access because you don't have insurance is also important.
One thing I was going to add to that just really quickly is that sometimes certain jobs also have what's called an EAP. And so that means that individuals can have a certain amount of free sessions. Sometimes it's 6, sometimes it's 10, sometimes it's 12. So I just wanted to add that as well if folks wanted to have information about that or look into that depending on what organization or company they're working for. EAP? Ooh, I'm blanking.
Employee Assistance Program.
Yes, thank you.
And I have one more thing to say. So I told you Alabama was leading with maternal deaths. So one thing that our governor recently did is made sure that with Medicaid, we've extended maternal health coverage, mental health coverage. Medicaid once did not pay for mental health. It has to cover those moms up to 1 year after delivery now. So that's to help reduce those numbers so everybody has access. But again, finding those providers is very important.
Yeah.
And I can say that, like, if you call the 211 as a resource that does with bills and stuff, if you call that number and tell them what you're looking for, that sometimes can direct you to where you can get help for free.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
211.
Is that on your thing?
Do we have 211?
I think y'all
I
did.
think it's 988 for us, right?
988.
Yeah. So it'll be dependent on the state that you're living in. But yeah, we have a few resources that are similar up there. We also gave some resources on how to find a provider on your own. So what websites you could go to find a provider. Any other questions?
Yes. When looking for a provider, is there a certain skill set that this provider should have? You know, when you're looking at their resume or whatever, what are you looking for?
Yeah, I can talk about it a little bit. I think it depends. I think it depends on the type of services that you're seeking. You definitely want to make sure you're seeing someone that's licensed, first and foremost. And then there are some things to think about as it relates to therapies that might be culturally adapted. And so sometimes for black women specifically, or black folks in general, what they want to see is someone that looks like them in the therapy space. And so if there are ways to identify, can I have a black therapist? Some don't want a black therapist, if I'm being honest, but sometimes a lot of people do. And so that's something to think about. And then think about looking at what their, what their listed presentations or approaches are. There can also be some helpful information around, is this something that's going to be applicable to me specifically for the things that I might be struggling with or the concerns that I might have specifically. And so sometimes providers will list out what types of presentations they'll work with, whether that's anxiety, whether that's depression, whether that's trauma, for example, so on and so forth. And so sometimes looking for those very specific things could also be something that's very helpful. Now, you also don't want to see a therapist that has every presentation listed, because that might be a red flag, if I'm being honest. Because I think that there is not a therapist that's well-versed or specialized in every single thing. But sometimes that is something that will happen, and that's something to be mindful of in terms of what type of care or what type of therapist you might be looking for specifically. There are some websites online, and that may even be included in the links that we have on our presentation, where you can go in and specify demographics for yourself and what you would prefer in a therapist specifically, whether it's by race or gender, or whether it's by location, things like that. There are websites that allow you to go in and specify what you would like specifically in a therapist.
I'll just add to that. I think once you make it past that process, so like LaKaylin said, many therapists will give you a bio. They will tell you the things that they usually treat, the types of people they usually work with, what type of approaches they use to work with people. And so you'll see that generally. Once you make it past that stage, I always like to tell people, finding a therapist is like finding a good partner. So if you don't, when you meet your therapist, if you feel like, okay, this is not someone who clicks with me, it's okay for you to be honest about that and say, I'm going to continue to look for someone who does, right? We as therapists understand that because we're all human at the end of the day, right? So we're not all going to work cohesively together. We might not always be the right fit depending on what someone is coming in with. So you have to make sure that you are honest with your therapist and say, okay, this might not be working. I need to look for someone else. So that's completely okay too. That's a normal part of the process.
I think that's true. I think that's all the process that sometimes sways people away from therapy.
Yes.
Where if it didn't work the first time, it's never going to work for me, and that's not necessarily true. And then there was also something Courtney said around honesty, and one thing to think about, especially as therapists and then also individuals who might be interested in learning more about therapy or entering into therapy. Therapy doesn't work if you're not in a space where you can be honest.
Yes.
And so that's something that's very important. If you don't feel like you have a connection with a clinician, it's okay. It might be hurtful. It might be sad, but I know that there's a clinician out there that can be very beneficial for everyone if that's a resource that they need.
Yeah.
So how is it that we support a woman who might be in this situation? She might have one child, she might have 10, and she might be single. And the more that she has, the more society says, like, why are we going to do this? Because nobody told her to keep having all those children. That has nothing to do with the fact that she still needs help or mental health, because a lot of the times it might be that child 3 or 4, the man just totally disappeared, and now I'm still here trying to feed my babies, trying to take care of them. I can't take care of myself, and nobody cares. Where do we go with that? Like, if you have no support system for a female that might be in those shoes, because they're out there.
Good question. Very, very, very good question. One thing that comes to mind specifically as it relates to how do we show up for women, especially when they are in need of it. I think we probably all know a woman or women specifically who don't have a support system around them. And so then the question becomes, how can we be of support to them? But then also, how can we be of support to them in a way that doesn't seem abrasive or it doesn't seem like I'm stepping on their toes? One part of that is simply just asking them what they need. Sometimes when we make assumptions about what people need, we step on their toes even more. We deter them away even more from seeking help. But sometimes when we go to them genuinely and ask, what is it that you need right now in this space? That's something that can be very detrimental. Let that woman that's in that space who doesn't have that support identify what she needs, and then maybe the people around her, sometimes that might be outside of the family, sometimes that might mean people that are mentors or people who are in the church, for example, as opposed to someone that's very close or interconnected to her, might have to step up and be there for that specific woman. Because I think that there are society labels or societal labels that have been passed down for generations on Black women, especially for those who might have had several children, or who haven't went the traditional pathway that sometimes individuals impose on what Black women are supposed to be. I think historically, those stereotypes of Black women being welfare queens are something that has led to the strong Black woman schema in the first place. And then that woman who might have multiple children, like you said, who might not have that support, they're not saying anything because they already know how society has labeled them. And so that's something, again, that makes them not want to seek treatment, not want to seek help, because there hasn't been a space where they've been provided to be vulnerable and to ask for the things that they need. So those are some things that come to my mind.
That's what I was just about to get to. So one thing we learned when we presented this to the consortium is that we lack a lot of support groups in our Black community. So if you look on Facebook, there are a lot of postpartum support groups or just mother type support groups for women that you see, but they don't look a lot like us. So I think in our mind we say, oh, well, we can't relate. So I do know that there is a need for us as Black women to establish support groups and have those groups readily available for those moms. In an interview I did with a mom before, she shared with me what that really looked like. So I always thought that, okay, they want somebody that's their age maybe, or somebody a little bit older, because I want to know what that support group looked like. They said a mixture. So they don't always want the older mom, because they said sometimes the older mom is judgmental. And so I said, yes, we can. We got to teach our older moms not to be as judgmental. So we can, because they have a lot of knowledge and wisdom that they can share as well. So we don't want to eliminate them. But also they want moms that are at the same stage. So if I'm 6 weeks postpartum, they want that mom that's 6 weeks postpartum. But they also want somebody that's slightly ahead, is what has been shared with me. And when they say slightly ahead, maybe somebody that's 12 weeks postpartum, so I can see the light a little bit. Because I know we probably didn't say this earlier, but postpartum depression does not end at 6 weeks. That's what we mistakenly think. Postpartum depression is over after 6 weeks. She's good now. She's past her 6-week visit. Absolutely not. It can last up to a year. That's why these moms are dying 1 year after delivery, because we're like, oh, she's past her 6 weeks. She's fine. Absolutely not. Pay attention to that mom. And we've got to do a better job and get these support groups out there and advertise them. They have exercise groups on Facebook or breastfeeding groups, but why is there not a mental health support group for Black women, specific to us as Black women, so that we can identify with each other? So I think that's very important for us to get established, and we're depending on the community to help us with that, because that's going to be very important in helping that mom that may be on baby 10. Helping her, because maybe that's associated with her mental health. That's her coping mechanism. She's continuing to have these babies.
Also, one other question, what does it look like when they're at that point of throwing in the towel? Is that specific to the individual, or is there certain stages or things that we go through or they go through, and we say, hey, look, you might need to go talk to Lakeisha or whatever, because we think, she's at the breaking point.
Okay. I will say it is different for every individual. I think one of the keys to what LaKaylin shared is that strong Black woman schema has allowed us to look and present very resiliently in a lot of different spaces. So it can be hard to see, especially from the outside looking in, when a Black woman has reached that breaking point, right? And so that's why it's important to look for those little and subtle things that we talked about in the previous slide. So if she is struggling to complete things that she used to be able to do, like she might not be able to move from the bed to the bathroom, not being able to put on clothes, not being able to eat, or crying all the time, right? Again, we might think to ourselves, okay, that's just normal part of pregnancy, right? But it's not. These are things that are causing difficulty in the day-to-day. So when you start seeing that, it's important to kind of say, okay, wait a minute, something's not right. And remember, how many Black women experience postpartum depression? 1 in 2, right? And so it's more likely that when she's having those types of things, that there might be some postpartum depression going on rather than not. And so erring on the safe side can also be a good way to recognize before she throws in a towel, because like LaKaylin said, even though many Black women do wait until the breaking point, the goal is to not let them get there, right? And so recognizing those symptoms early so that we can get them help way before that step.
Check now to see if is this from single mothers or is this mothers with spouses?
So the research says that it's 1 in 2 Black women generally. Single mothers has been found to be 6 times more likely to have depression. So it's way higher.
So then that means there's something else that needs to be done.
Mm-hmm. Because if you think about it, one of the things that contributes to depression is that lack of support, feeling lonely, feeling isolated. And so if you're already in a situation that is high stress, having a baby, right? Plus you couple on top of that, being a single mother, having to handle things on your own, you're at a lot more risk.
There was one thing I was going to add to what Courtney was sharing before as it relates to, I can't remember exactly off the top of my head, but one thing that we often, I think, forget within the Black community or just as people in general is that we all have different temperaments. And basically what that means is what Courtney can take, I might not be able to take it. Or what I can take, Courtney might not be able to take it. And so when we think about things like trauma or at what point do we intervene, sometimes we do intervene and we say things that might be very invalidating. Or you should just be strong because I went through that same thing and I was fine. Sometimes those are messages that are passed down a lot, but again, like I said, we all have different temperaments. What I can take, another woman might not be able to take, and vice versa. And sometimes we forget that, especially when there are certain messages that are passed down about us having to be strong or having to persevere. And then as we think about resilience, people don't often recognize what it takes to get to a point of resilience. There's usually this struggle that is thought of as having to contextualize how strong a Black woman is. And so if you haven't struggled, then you're not strong, and that is definitely a stigma that needs to be lessened a lot, or deleted is a way, for lack of a better words, because that is something that's keeping a lot of Black women stuck. That's something that's keeping a lot of Black women from seeking help. That's also something that's keeping a lot of Black women isolated and not letting people know what's going on, because there might be messages around, well, I did it, and I was fine, so why can't you do it? Which, again, is very invalidating.
Or again, the term mental health. I don't have anxiety. I don't have depression. What are you talking about? No, that's not me. It's not going to happen to me.
And then he's contributing to her mental health. So is there anything out here for the spouse, the male, to outside of coming to a session like this? Because sometimes we don't get a lot of males to come to sessions. So what is out there to help them to be able to help her cope with what she's dealing with?
That's a really good question.
So those support groups need to be not just women. I'm glad he asked that question, because Courtney, you know how big I am on that.
Yeah.
I know you have a different answer, but I want to go back to the support group.
Okay.
That doesn't need to be just women. That's why we said this was open to all. Because if we all know what's going on in our community, we can help each other. So it's a team effort. Like, I brought these ladies in from counseling. I'm nursing. It's a team effort because we all bring a different perspective. So maybe that spouse can bring a different perspective for the woman that's actually experiencing that mental health problem, and vice versa.
No, that's a really good point. I think too, there's a couple things that when you said that, I thought of a couple things. First, there is a lot of stigma, if we break it down even further, among Black men about mental health, about being strong as well, right? And so I think it also is a matter of teaching our Black men that it's okay to seek mental health services, right? So just like there are services available for Black women through their insurance, there are also services related to mental health that Black men can seek through their insurance. So it's important to educate yourself on what mental health services are available for you specifically. Another thing is, I think on that support group front, Black men also need their own safe space to support one another in addressing mental health, right? And so it's important that you and your spouse have a shared space, because at the end of the day, you're a team, right? But that you also have your separate spaces to process how the pregnancy, how the birth have affected you individually. Because like LaKaylin said, how it affects one partner might be different than how it affects the other. And that may not be something that is easily understood by your spouse. So it's important to maybe process that outside as well.
I think all of that is very true. One thing I was going to add is kind of like a comment, but there is someone in our program, actually, researches the Strong Black Woman schema, but also looks into what type of schema is there for Black men as well. And then what does that mean for the impact that it has on their romantic relationships, specifically for individuals or Black folks who might be married or who might be in relationships generally, and then what do those schemas mean for the types of relationships that they have, the type of trust that's present or the lack thereof, the type of emotional support that's present in that relationship. And so I definitely think that there needs to be more spaces, more research, more support groups, etc., where Black men's voices are also highlighted, because it's not just a one-sided thing. But yeah.
Any final thoughts or questions? Well, we want to, oh, you have another? Okay. I was going to say you have another slide. Okay, we'll pass to the next slide. Yeah, I think we have a resource slide. So we'll leave this resource slide, there we go, up. These are just some clinicians in the Auburn community.
And then the Black Women's Mental Health Institute is out of Birmingham, Alabama, but they also offer a lot of free resources. And then if folks can't travel to Birmingham, for example, they also offer services online. So that's a resource.
So these are just counseling service resources if anybody wants to take a picture, so that you have access to these. But other than that, we just want to thank y'all for having us. We hope that this was insightful. And if you do have any questions, Dr. Ware has our contact information and be happy to reach out. Yeah, thank y'all.
Thank you again to Courtney, and like